I was 17 years old the first time Sergeant Orak looked at me the way a predator looks at something it can't classify. Not a threat, not prey, something else, something the taxonomy doesn't cover. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the intake form in his hand, looked at me standing in line with 43 alien cadets who were all a head taller and considerably wider, and then looked at the form again. His jaw, if you could call it a jaw, it was more like a secondary cranial shelf hinged below the main skull, did something I would later learn meant recalibration, like a computer finding an unexpected variable and deciding whether to reroute or crash. He chose to reroute. "Vas," he said. He had a voice like gravel poured down a metal pipe. "Dario Vas." "Yes, Sergeant." "You are listed here as an advanced cohort intake, track 4. "That's what my paperwork says, Sergeant." He looked at me one more time, the secondary jaw thing again. Then he filed me into line with the rest of the track 4 cadets, and that was that. I want to be honest about something before I go any further. I had no idea what I was walking into. The administrative error that landed me in track 4 at the Valdres Combat Institute was genuine. A clerical misfiling somewhere between the human intake office on Meridian Station and the automated sorting system that the Institute used to assign cadets to tracks. Someone had entered my training record into the wrong field. My years of contact sport on Earth, logged in the system as hours of structured combat training, had been cross-referenced against the Institute's competency rubric, run through an algorithm that didn't know what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was and had approximated it as something close to a Valdres Unarmed Combat Intermediate Certificate, and spat me out the other end flagged for Track 4. Track 4 was not the intermediate track. Track 4 was the track for cadets who were expected to graduate, and then immediately be handed a command position somewhere that required a person who could take a room apart with their hands. I found this out on the shuttle from the intake center to the main campus. The cadet who told me was named Svek, 8 feet of pale gray reptilian muscle with eyes on articulated stalks that could rotate independently. He was track 4 because his species, the Varath, produced neural combat bonding at age 6, meaning he'd been hardwired for coordinated close-quarters response since before he could reach a standard doorknob. He told me this conversationally, the way you might mention that you'd learned to read young. Then he asked what my qualifier had been. "Wrestling," I said, "and some other stuff." He rotated one eye toward me. The other stayed pointed out the shuttle window. "Wrestling," he repeated. "Yeah. That is a recreational activity. Mostly, it gets serious when you're good at it." He thought about this for a moment. I could tell he was being polite. Svek would turn out to be one of the better people I met at Valdres, which is saying something because most of the rest of them were not particularly interested in being polite to a human who had no business being in their cohort. We landed at the main campus just after the local dawn, which on Valdres Prime meant the sky was the color of old pewter, and the air smelled faintly of something between ozone and iron. The campus was not beautiful in any way a tourism board would use. It was functional in the way that a well-made tool is functional, every line serving a purpose, nothing wasted on aesthetics, every surface chosen for durability. The sparring halls were the largest buildings. You could tell by the acoustic reinforcement panels running the full height of the exterior walls, and by the sound that leaked out even through those panels, a constant, percussive rhythm of impact that never quite stopped. We were issued kit in the first hour. Standard institutional fabric, gray-black, cut for a species-neutral body shape that fit a human about as well as a shirt fits a coat rack. The boots were better, adjustable internal scaffold, and for once the human proportions were close enough to the baseline that I only needed one adjustment toggle. We were then marched to Orientation Hall, which was a misnomer, because what happened there was not an orientation in any sense that implied welcome or acclimatization. It was a statement of terms. Orak stood at the front of the hall. He was Valdris-born, which meant his species had evolved on this planet, which meant he was built for it. Compact for a Valdris native, which still put him at 6'9", and about 280 of muscle that looked like it had been bolted on rather than grown. His skin was a dark, textured gray-green. He had the secondary jaw. His hands had an extra knuckle on each finger, which gave his grip a mechanical advantage that no human hand could match. He'd served 22 years in the Galactic Rapid Response Force before coming to Valdris Combat Institute to teach, which he had done for another 11. He did not introduce himself. His name was on the wall behind him, along with his service record, because at Valdris the wall behind the sergeant is not a blank surface, it's a document. You were meant to read it before he spoke. I read it in the 40 seconds while the last cadets filed in. The highlights: 17 confirmed close quarters engagements, 6 classified operations that just had redaction bars where the details would have been, 4 commendations that included words I'd have to look up later. The final line of the service summary read, Instructor Qualification, Valdris Combat Institute, Track 4. Specialty, Terminal Engagement Theory and Practice. Terminal engagement. I had to think about that one for a second. You are here, Orak said, once the room was still, because each of you has demonstrated a qualifying level of close quarters aptitude. Track 4 is not a training program. Track 4 is a refinement program. You arrive with the foundation. I remove what is unnecessary and make what remains faster, more precise, and more lethal. He walked the length of the front of the hall once. His boots made no sound. For 280 of hard-packed muscle, he moved like something poured rather than assembled. The first thing I am going to do, he said, is show you what this track looks like at its current standard. You will observe a demonstration bout between 2 Track 4 finalists from the cycle ahead of yours. You will watch it once. You will not be given a breakdown. You will not be given slow-motion replay. You will watch it once, and then you will have 5 minutes to speak to each other about what you observed, and then I will tell you what you missed. He nodded to someone at the back of the room. A panel in the floor at the front of the hall slid back, revealing a sparring circle, not a mat, a circle of inlaid surface, slightly depressed, with a texture that gave grip in every direction. 2 figures in the same gray-black kit we were wearing walked out from separate access corridors and stepped into the circle. They were both Varath, both considerably larger than Svek. The bout lasted, by my count, 11 seconds. In those 11 seconds, each of them initiated, was countered, reinitiated, was countered again, and then one of them found a leverage angle that the other couldn't answer, and it was over. There was no drama to it. It was just 2 systems running at high speed until one of them found a hard solution. The room was quiet. 5 minutes, Orak said. Talk. The cadets around me started talking. I listened more than I spoke. What I heard was primarily technical, angles, leverage chains, the specific joint manipulation that ended it, the counter that nearly worked. Svek, who was standing to my left, had a detailed and accurate breakdown of the first 8 seconds. He missed one thing. The way the losing Varath's weight shift in the third exchange had been slightly off-axis, not because of skill failure but because of something they were deliberately baiting. I filed that away and didn't mention it. Orak came back after exactly 5 minutes and told us what we had missed. He missed the bait too. I still didn't mention it. That was day 1. Day 2 was the first actual training session, and it was where I began to understand the scale of what I'd wandered into. The Track 4 curriculum was organized around a concept the Institute called the engagement envelope, the set of physical and cognitive conditions inside which a trained fighter operates. You could expand your envelope through drilling, scenario repetition, and conditioning, but your baseline envelope was biological. The Varath had a larger baseline envelope than most species by a significant margin. So did the Drev, which were the other predominant species in the cohort. Bipedal, 3-jointed arms, neural response time about 40% faster than human baseline. So did the Sukar, who I hadn't encountered before Valdris, and who turned out to be a species with bioluminescent musculature that contracted in visual pulses when they were under physical stress, which made their exertion completely visible to anyone paying attention. That last part was interesting. I had a standard human baseline. According to the Institute's intake metrics, which we reviewed on day 2 in a seminar with an adjunct instructor named Parev, the human engagement envelope was rated at mid-tier for the species represented in Track 4. Adequate, Parev called it, in the pleasant tone of someone who considers adequate to be a polite word for insufficient. The human physiology presents certain compensatory features: a high pain threshold relative to neural density, an unusual capacity for extended physical output without catastrophic degradation, and a documented tendency toward contextual improvisation. These are not disadvantages. They are simply not advantages of the first order. Nobody looked at me when he said this. That was the polite version of everyone looking at me. I sat in the third row and took notes. What Parev didn't know, and what I didn't volunteer, was that I'd been doing contact sports seriously since I was 9. Not as recreation, or not only as recreation. My father had a gym. His father had trained fighters. I grew up on the mats the way other kids grow up in their parents' workshops, and by the time I was 15 I had about 3,000 hours of live training, not counting conditioning, not counting the coaching I'd been doing for the younger kids since I was 12. I wasn't a professional. I wasn't a prodigy. I was just someone who had spent a very large portion of his life learning, at a granular level, what happens when one body tries to control another body that doesn't want to be controlled. The Institute knew none of this, because the field on the intake form that asked for years of structured combat instruction had a drop-down, and the drop-down didn't have a box for grew up in a jiu-jitsu gym. It had a box for recreational contact sport, which I'd selected honestly, and an algorithm had then done the rest. Nobody checked. The paperwork said Track 4 it was. The daily structure at Valdris was morning conditioning, mid-session drilling, afternoon scenario work, and one evening seminar per week. Lights came on at 4:30 local time, which on Valdris Prime meant before full dawn, which meant running the conditioning route in the pewter half-dark with the iron ozone smell thickest in the morning air. The course was 3.7 kilometers of mixed terrain, flat sections across the campus stone, 2 significant grade changes where the ground banked up toward the perimeter walls, and a technical section through what the Institute called the contact corridor. A narrow, ground-level passage between 2 training buildings where the path was irregular enough that you couldn't put your head down and just run. You had to watch your footing. The contact corridor was where the pack thinned every single day, without exception. The cadets who lost ground in the corridor never made it back. I lost ground in the corridor for the first 4 days. The irregular surface was manageable. I'd run trails back home and the footwork wasn't foreign, but the Valdris gravity interacted with the grade changes in a way my legs didn't expect, and I was bracing wrong, burning more energy than I should have been on every downgrade. On day 5, I figured out the braking angle and stopped losing ground. On day 9, I was keeping pace through the corridor instead of coming out the back end behind the middle pack. The conditioning was brutal for everyone. I want to be clear about that. I was not immune to the conditioning. The Valdris campus gravity was 0.9 standard, which sounds like an advantage until you realize that every other aspect of the planet's atmosphere, pressure gradient, and ambient temperature had been calibrated for a species that evolved there, and the cumulative effect on a human body was that I ran about 8% below my Earth normal physical output for the first 3 weeks. I was slower than I'd been at home. I was tired in a way that didn't fully respond to sleep. I ran the morning conditioning route every day. I came in at the back of the cohort for the first 4 days. On day 5, I moved up to the middle third. On day 9, I was in the top half. Not because I got dramatically stronger. The 8% gap was still there, but because I stopped fighting the planet and started working with what I had. Aurak noticed. He didn't say anything. He noticed the way a person who has been watching fighters for 33 years notices things, a small adjustment in posture that he stored in whatever ledger he kept. The drilling was where the gap was most visible and also where it mattered least. The drilling was about mechanics, the technical execution of specific movements, the correct angles, the correct weight distribution, the specific contact points. The alien cadets had advantages in reach, in natural leverage, in raw speed. What I found, about a week in, was that I had spent enough time drilling the foundational versions of most of these movements that the alien variations weren't foreign to me. They were extensions. The same principles, different geometries. My hands couldn't do what a Varath's hands could do, but I understood what the Varath's hands were trying to accomplish, and there were usually at least two other ways to accomplish the same thing. I was not the best driller in the cohort. I was not close to the best driller in the cohort, but I was functional in ways that surprised the cadets who'd been watching my conditioning numbers. Tesvik noticed this before anyone else. Tesvik was Drev, tall even for his species, which already ran tall close to 7 feet, with the 3-jointed arms folded like architectural brackets when he was at rest. He was the highest rated intake in the cohort, which everyone knew because Aurak had mentioned it on day 1 in the specific way that senior military instructors mention a cadet's rating when they want the rest of the room to understand the standard they're being held to. Tesvik carried this without any visible weight. He wasn't arrogant in the way of someone trying to establish dominance. He was arrogant in the way of someone who had never had to try. The rating was accurate. He was exceptional. He started watching me during the scenario drills in the 2nd week. Not obviously, the Drev have a wide peripheral field and he didn't need to turn his head. But I caught it. And then on day 11, during a drill rotation where partners were assigned by the adjunct running the session, the adjunct assigned Tesvik and me to work together. We were drilling a specific entry, a controlled approach to engagement range, the standard institute curriculum for track for week 2. Tesvik ran the drill correctly, efficiently, with the easy precision of someone who'd already done the advanced version of this 3 years ago on a different planet. He glanced at me between reps. "You anticipate," he said. It wasn't a compliment and it wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. "Yeah," I said. "You read the setup before I commit." "Most of the time." He thought about this. "What are you reading?" "Weight shift, mostly where your lead foot is tracking before your hands move." Another pause. He ran the drill again, this time with a deliberate variation in his lead foot placement. I adjusted earlier than he expected. He said. We finished the rotation in silence. He didn't say anything else about it that day. But the next day during open drilling, a 40-minute block where cadets could work on whatever the session's theme was without assigned partners, he came and found me. "Again," he said. We worked for 30 minutes. I learned things about the 3-joint arm mechanic that the curriculum hadn't covered yet. He learned, I think, based on his expressions, which were hard to read on a Drev face, that what I was doing wasn't instinct and wasn't luck. It was a different set of trained habits overlaid on the same fundamental problem. Tesvik did not become my friend. He didn't become my enemy either. He became something that Valdris probably had a technical term for, a serious observer. He watched me the way you watch something that doesn't fit the expected pattern, not to discard it, but to understand what pattern it actually fits. It was Tesvik who told me at the end of week 2 that a challenge bout was coming. He said it the way you say something that requires no particular editorial weight. There will be a demonstration bout in the main sparring hall Friday afternoon. Aurak has selected 2 cadets. I asked which 2. Tesvik looked at me. You, and a cadet named Vren. He is Varath. He finished his first track 4 cycle 2 years ago and was retained for a second cycle at his own request. He is the strongest cadet in the building. Why me? I asked. Because Aurak wants to know. I thought about that for a moment. Know what? What you are, Tesvik said, and whether you belong here. He said it without cruelty. That was just the framework. The Institute had a threshold, and Aurak was the one who enforced it. If you didn't belong, the demonstration bout was the mechanism by which that got clarified. Vren had been involved in 3 previous demonstration bouts. All 3 of the cadets he demonstrated with had left the Institute within a week. I went back to my bunk that night and thought about it for a while. Let me tell you what I knew about myself going into that Friday. I knew that I was slower than Vren in absolute terms. Vareth's neural response was faster than human by a measurable margin, and Vren had spent 2 years on top of a Track 4 curriculum specifically designed to make that margin count. I knew that I was weaker than Vren. Not in the close ratio way. I wasn't dramatically weaker, but I was working against a natural leverage disadvantage created by the extra knuckle geometry, and in a ground engagement that disadvantage compounded. I knew that the pressure of the demonstration context would be on me in a way it wouldn't be on him, because he'd done this before and I hadn't. What I also knew was this. I had approximately 3,000 hours of live training against resisting opponents. Not drilling, not scenarios. Actual live rolling and sparring and cage work against people who were trying to make me lose. 3,000 hours of that specific thing creates something that doesn't show up on intake forms and doesn't translate cleanly into any rubric the Institute had tested me against. It creates a very fine, very specific type of pattern recognition. The ability to read a body that's trying to hide what it's about to do under pressure in real time. Vren was trained to the highest standard the Institute offered, but the Institute's standard was built on drilling and scenario work and interspecies technical analysis. It was very good at producing fighters who could execute optimally within known engagement envelopes. It was not, as far as I could tell, particularly good at producing fighters who could handle someone who didn't fight the way the envelope predicted. I didn't know if that would be enough, but it was what I had. Friday came. The demonstration bout was in the main sparring hall, which I hadn't been inside until that afternoon. It was larger than I'd expected. The ceiling was maybe 40 feet overhead, and the space was configured for spectator viewing on 3 sides, elevated seating built into the walls in concentric rings. Most of the Institute was there, not just Track 4. Instructors, staff, cadets from other tracks. Vren was, evidently, worth watching. Aurak stood at the edge of the sparring circle. He looked at me when I walked in, then at the form in his hand, the same form, or one like it, and then back at me. The secondary jaw thing, recalibrating. Voss, he said. Sergeant, you understand the format of a demonstration bout. No contact outside the circle, full engagement within it. Bout ends at submission, incapacitation, or my call. He paused a half-second on that last one. Standard. Yes, Sergeant. Vren is a 2-cycle Track 4 finisher. He has cleared 4 demonstration bouts. Do you understand what that means? Yes, Sergeant. Good. He looked at the form again. You have 11 days of Track 4 instruction. You have a recreational combat background. The records indicate approximately mid-tier physical engagement capacity for your species. He looked up. I want to know what the records don't say. I didn't answer that. There wasn't anything to add. He nodded into the circle. Vren was already there. He was bigger than I'd expected from the week of watching him at distance, broader in the chest, with the extra knuckle geometry of his hands immediately visible, the fingers slightly longer than standard Varath, which on a Varath was already long. He was looking at me the way a serious fighter looks at a new opponent, not dismissively, but with the calm economy of someone running a quick technical assessment, and arriving at a conclusion they consider reliable. He'd seen the same intake metrics Aurak had. He'd done the math. He wasn't wrong to feel calm. We stood at opposite edges of the circle. I'd been in competitive environments before, not at this level, nothing close to this level, but enough to know what my body did in the first 30 seconds before engagement started. It went quiet. Not numb. Quiet. Like the way a room goes quiet when you've been listening to something for a long time and it stops, and the absence of it clarifies everything else. Aurak raised one hand. The room settled. "Standard opening," he said. "You'll engage on my mark. The mark is not a countdown, there is no count. When my hand drops, you engage." He held the hand up. He held it for 4 seconds longer than either of us expected. That was the first test, not the bout, just the wait. A lot of fighters tighten when the signal is delayed. It breaks the rhythm they've built up in their head, and they spend the first second of the actual engagement catching up to themselves. I've waited for longer. I've waited in tournaments for delayed signals that went out 9, 10 seconds past the expected point, because tournament officials have their own timing, and you learn early that your rhythm has to float, not anchor. So I waited. The hand dropped. Vren came forward fast, not a rush, a controlled advance, the standard track 4 opening geometry. Lead shoulder slightly dropped, hands at the carry position that Aurak had drilled us on for 11 days, perfectly executed. I watched his lead foot. Here is the thing about 11 days of track 4 curriculum versus 3,000 hours of live training. The curriculum is better at a lot of things. It's more technically precise. It covers more engagement contexts. It's calibrated against a wider range of opponent biologies. But it has one limitation that I noticed in the very first drilling session and had been thinking about ever since. The curriculum has preferred solutions. Every engagement type has a set of high percentage responses that the curriculum teaches, drills, and reinforces. This is correct and efficient pedagogy. You teach the responses that work most often against the most opponents, and you build fluency in those responses so they're available under pressure. The limitation is that an opponent who has trained against the same curriculum knows what the preferred solutions are. Vren had trained inside this curriculum for 2 full cycles. He knew every preferred solution, and he knew how to close off the angles that led to them. What he didn't know, what the curriculum didn't account for, was someone who approached the same problems from a completely different set of trained habits, and then picked the non-preferred solution not because they'd been drilled on it, but because they could see, in real time, that the preferred angle was closed. His lead foot tracked left, which on a Vareth at this body size with this specific arm-length ratio meant his opening engagement priority was going to be high, a collar control or a head position grip, the standard Vareth high entry opening that the curriculum addressed in week 4. I hadn't been taught the week 4 counter. I didn't need it. I'd felt the same grip priority about 800 times on Earth, in different hands with different geometries, and I knew what it looked like from the inside. I didn't give him the high entry. I went low, not a tackle, not a lunge, a level change, dropping my center of gravity and changing my angle before he could adjust his grip priority to track it. Low attacks are common enough that he'd have a response for them. His response came in at about the speed I expected, which was fast, his right arm dropping to intercept and redirect. And for a half-second we were in a position that the Track 4 curriculum probably had a name for that I didn't know, where his arm was engaged with mine at about mid-chest height and neither of us had clean leverage. That half-second is where 3,000 hours lives. I didn't think about what I did next. Thinking about what you do next is for drilling. In live engagement, you're running a parallel process. Your analytical mind is watching. Your trained body is responding. And the responses that survive 3,000 hours of live rolling are the ones that have been pressure tested against real resistance enough times that they don't need the analytical mind to authorize them. My hands found the angle before my brain named it. The grip came in at a specific point on his right arm, using the fact that I'd shifted low to change the leverage plane. And then I used the weight shift I'd seen Tesvik use a week earlier and redirected his own mass. It's hard to describe what submission grappling feels like from the inside when it works correctly. It doesn't feel like a fight. It feels like a conversation where you've asked a question, and the other person's body has answered it before they knew you were asking. The angle I found gave me his back. Getting his back, in grappling terms, is the position from which almost everything is available and from which escape is very difficult. On a Vareth with the extra-knuckle geometry, it was a different problem than it would be on a human, but the fundamental mechanic was the same, and I had 3,000 hours of the fundamental mechanic. I held the position. I didn't submit him. I want to be clear about that. I didn't squeeze until he tapped, didn't push for the finish in the way you push for the finish in a competitive context. I held him, with control, in a position from which if I'd wanted to end the bout I could have ended the bout, and I waited. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Orek said hold. We stopped. I released the position. Vren stood up. His face did something I couldn't read. Vareth expressions are architectural rather than muscular, and reading them requires familiarity I didn't have yet. But he looked at me for a moment before he walked off the circle, and there was something in it that wasn't the dismissive math he'd run at the start. Something that was actually looking. The room was quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for the next thing to happen. The specific quiet of a room that has watched something it doesn't have a ready category for. Orek stood at the edge of the circle for a moment. He looked at the form in his hand. He looked at me. The secondary jaw, recalibrating for longer this time. He didn't say anything immediately. He folded the form. He put it in the breast pocket of his uniform, which was not where he usually put forms. Forms went on the clipboard, not the pocket. I noticed this. I didn't know what it meant yet. Track 4, he said, addressing the room. What you observed was an engagement between a 2-cycle finisher operating at the top of the curriculum standard and a cadet with 11 days of institute instruction. He paused. Note the outcome and what produced it. We will discuss it in seminar. He looked at me once more. The expression on a Valdris face is easier to read than a Varath face. The secondary jaw and the brow ridges give you more signal. What I read was not admiration. It wasn't warmth. It was the specific look of someone revising an assumption, carefully, with the precision of someone who has built their life around accurate assessment and takes the revision seriously. Voss, he said. Sergeant, where did you train? It wasn't a question. The inflection was flat. He wasn't asking, he was processing. My father's gym, I said, on Earth. He absorbed this. What is the discipline? Jiu-jitsu mostly, some wrestling. Some competition boxing, enough to understand the striking range. Years. 8 to compete level, longer if you count the coaching and the early stuff. He was quiet for a moment. The Institute has no classification for it. I know. The Institute's intake algorithm cross-referenced your log hours against the Valdris Intermediate Combat Certificate. I know. Another pause. The form came out of the breast pocket. He looked at it. The paperwork lists you as a recreational contact sport practitioner assigned to track 4 in error. That's what it says. Is it an error? I thought about how to answer that. The algorithm made a mistake, I said, but I'm not sure the output was wrong. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he put the form back in his pocket, and this time I understood what the pocket meant. It meant the form was going somewhere other than the standard administrative chain. It meant something about the form was going to change. Dismissed, he said, to me then to the room. I walked off the circle. Svek was in the front row of the spectator seating. I saw him as I stepped off. Those eye stalks both pointed at me, fully forward, which I had learned was his version of close attention. He said nothing. He gave me a single nod, the slow, deliberate kind, the kind that means I saw what I saw and I know what it means, and then he looked away. Tesvik was 3 rows back. He was already standing, preparing to leave with the rest of the room. He didn't nod. He didn't gesture. He just looked at me with the expression of someone whose hypothesis has been confirmed, and whose interest in the data is now considerably higher than it was before. The week after the demonstration bout was the same as the week before it, on the surface. Morning conditioning, mid-session drilling, afternoon scenario work. The curriculum continued at the same pace it always had. Nobody in the cohort said anything directly to me about the bout. Valdres cadets were not, as a group, given to commentary. You demonstrated your quality or you didn't, and commentary on either was considered a waste of engagement time. What changed was subtler. The drill partners I was assigned to started working with a different quality of attention. Not holding back before, they hadn't been going easy on me, but there's a difference between drilling against someone you've assessed as a known quantity and drilling against someone whose assessment you're revising. The known quantity gets your trained response. The unknown quantity gets your actual attention. I started getting the actual attention. Orak ran me separately once, 3 days after the bout, not in front of the cohort. He set up a drill rotation with 3 of the senior cadets, 2 Varath and a Drev, all of them second cycle, and had me work through a specific engagement scenario while he watched. He didn't coach during it. He just watched. Afterward, he said 2 things. One was technical, a specific adjustment to how I was using my weight in the transitional phase between level changes, and it was correct, and I thanked him for it. The second thing he said was this. You told Tesvik that you read weight shift. Yes, Sergeant. Before the commitment, before the hands telegraph. Usually. He thought about this. That is not a Track 4 curriculum skill. We do not teach it until the final seminar cycle, and we teach it as analysis, something you run after the engagement, in review. We do not teach it as real-time processing because the processing speed required is considered outside the range of reliable execution for most enrolled species. I didn't say anything. For humans, he asked. It's not universal, I said. It's trained. The hours create it. You do enough live rolling against people who are actively trying to hide their next move, you start to see through the hiding, and eventually your body starts responding to it before you've consciously named it. He absorbed this the way he absorbed most things, slowly, with precision. The Institute has not enrolled many humans. I know. Of the ones it has enrolled, none have been placed in Track 4. I know. There is a reason for that. I know that too. He looked at me. Do you consider the placement an error? I thought about this carefully. I thought about the 3,000 hours, and the demonstration bout, and the drill session we just run, and what I knew about what I didn't know, the gaps in my technical curriculum that would take a full cycle to close, maybe 2, the engagement scenarios I hadn't trained for, the alien biologies that didn't map cleanly to anything in my experience. I thought about what it meant to be genuinely in over your head, and whether what I was in was actually over my head or was just unfamiliar. Ask me again at the end of the cycle, I said. He looked at me for a moment longer. Then, that is a reasonable answer. The form, I found out 6 weeks later, had been sent to the Institute's registration office with a cover note from Orak. The cover note, which Perev, the adjunct, told me about in the specific way that people tell you about things they've been instructed not to tell you about, recommended a classification review. The form came back with a new notation in the classification field. It didn't say error corrected. It said assessment pending, non-standard intake, Track 4 incumbent. Incumbent, I had to look that one up too. The full cycle was 11 months. I won't walk you through all of it. Some of it is technical in ways that don't translate to a room that isn't already inside the curriculum, and some of it is just the grinding, ordinary texture of training that is too hard for you and that you do anyway because the alternative is to stop. I'll tell you the things that matter. I closed the conditioning gap by month 3. Not entirely. There was always a ceiling imposed by the planet, the gravity, the atmosphere, but to a degree that stopped mattering in practical terms. By month 4, I was running in the top quarter of the cohort on the conditioning route. By month 6, I was running second, behind a Vareth cadet named Gallus who had the longest stride in the building, and who I could not catch on a straight line but could pace on the technical sections. We never talked about it, we just ran. The weekly seminar was the one context at Valdris where something other than drilling and scenario work happened. Orek ran it himself, which I had not expected. I'd assumed seminars were adjunct territory. They were not. He ran them the same way he ran everything, with precise economy and no tolerance for imprecision in response. The seminar 2 days after the demonstration bout was on engagement anticipation, specifically on the difference between trained anticipation and reactive processing. Orek stood at the front of the seminar room, which was a smaller space than the main lecture hall, configured for a single cohort, with bench seating in a shallow arc facing a wall display. He pulled up the recording of the demonstration bout. He did not play the whole thing. He stopped it at the moment of the level change, the frame where my center of gravity dropped and Vren's response trajectory had already committed. "What happened here," he said, "it wasn't a question." Silence. In any other context, a seminar instructor using silence like that would be waiting for volunteers. In Orek's seminar, it meant he was going to call on someone, and the person called on had better not hedge. He looked at the recording, not at us, for a long 3 seconds. Then he looked at the room. Tesvik. Tesvik was in the second row. He gave a single answer, wait shift read, pre-commitment. The response trajectory locked before the level change completed. Correct. Orek advanced the recording 1 frame. This is the last frame in which a corrected response was possible. Vren's response trajectory locked here, 2 frames before the level change was detectable by standard visual processing. He paused. Voss, you read this 2 frames early. Explain the mechanism. Every head in the room turned to look at me. 42 cadets who had all watched the bout and were now watching me account for something that, by the curriculum standard, shouldn't have been possible. The lead foot, I said. Before the hands commit, there's a weight transfer through the front foot, a preload that happens in the hip first and then expresses through the foot. It's below the threshold of deliberate observation. You don't see it by trying to see it. You register it because you've been in physical contact with enough bodies in enough states of motion that the pattern is stored somewhere you can access faster than the visual processing chain. Silence. That is not in the curriculum, Orek said. No. Where is it in the literature? I don't know if it is. I've never looked for it. I learned it by feel, not by reading. He studied me for a moment. Proprioceptive pattern archive, he said, accumulated through sustained live resistance training, not visual recognition, somatic recognition running on a parallel track and triggering motor response before the visual channel has confirmed the stimulus. He said this the way someone says something they've been thinking about for 2 days and are now prepared to commit to out loud. That is what the algorithm could not assess, he said. You cannot measure a somatic archive on an intake form. He looked at the room. Note this. It will appear in your final cycle examination in a different form, and I expect you to recognize it. He closed the recording. He moved on. We did not discuss the bout again in formal seminar, but the framework he'd named Proprioceptive Pattern Archive, accumulated through live resistance hours, running on a parallel processing track, became a phrase I heard used in the cohort by cadets running their own technical analysis for the rest of the cycle. The technical curriculum remained the hardest part throughout. The Institute's advanced engagement theory assumed a set of baseline biomechanical givens that didn't apply to me, And every time I encountered a new scenario framework, I had to do a translation, figure out what the curriculum was actually trying to accomplish, and then find the version of that which worked in a human body. The Institute's advanced engagement theory assumed a set of baseline biomechanical givens that didn't apply to me, and every time I encountered a new scenario framework, I had to do a translation, figure out what the curriculum was actually trying to accomplish, and then find the version of that which worked in a human body. Some translations were direct. Some required building something new, with Aurek's input on 3 occasions when I was stuck and asked for it. He gave the input without editorializing. What he was doing with the input, whether he was noting it, recording it, doing something with it that I didn't know about, I didn't ask. Tesvik and I worked together regularly through the cycle. Not by assignment, he sought out the sessions. We didn't talk much during them. We worked, we stopped, we worked again. By month 5, I was learning the 3-joint leverage mechanics well enough to run counters that surprised him, which given his level I chose to take as a meaningful benchmark. He told me once, toward the end of the cycle, that what I was doing was not what the curriculum described, but that it arrived at the same places the curriculum described and sometimes arrived at them along paths that the curriculum had not accounted for. He said this as an observation. I said thank you. He nodded and we went back to work. Vren sought me out once about 4 months in. He found me in the equipment room after an evening conditioning session. He stood in the doorway for a moment, which I noticed because Vren didn't usually stand in doorways. He came in or he didn't. Then he came in. The bout, he said. Yeah. I've been thinking about the position. The back take. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. I have reviewed it 17 times in the session recording. I cannot identify the entry point. I thought about how to explain it. It came from the level change. When I dropped my center, I changed the plane of the engagement, and your grip priority was already set for high entry, so your response came in at a height that assumed I was still standing. I wasn't. So your arm came in at an angle that gave me access to a grip point it wouldn't have given me if we were both standing. He processed this. You anticipated that my response would not adjust for the level change. I thought it probably wouldn't. You were running the high entry sequence. I'd watched you drill it. When a sequence is that ingrained, the response pattern is ingrained too. The response pattern's height assumption is part of the sequence. A long pause. That is not in the curriculum. No. Where is it from? Same place everything else is. The hours. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded, the Varath nod, which is a slightly different head movement than the human version, a lowering of the secondary jaw rather than a chin dip, and he left. 3 weeks before the end of the cycle, Aurek called me to his office. His office was spare in the way that made you understand he spent very little time in it. A desk, a chair, a wall display showing current cohort metrics, the kind of functional absence of decoration that says I am only here to work. He was standing when I came in. He didn't tell me to sit. Classification review came back, he said. I heard it came back. I didn't hear what it said. He looked at me. Track 4, full cycle completion, assessment complete. Classification, non-standard intake, confirmed incumbent. He paused. The review board added a notation. What notation? They want the intake algorithm updated. Specifically, they want a new classification pathway for human combat sport practitioners with sustained training hours above a threshold figure. The algorithm currently treats all recreational contact sport as equivalent regardless of hours logged. The review board found that this creates a misclassification risk for humans that it does not create for other enrolled species because, and I am reading from the notation, humans in sustained contact sport training appear to develop a form of applied engagement pattern recognition that does not map cleanly to the Institute's existing competency rubrics, and therefore consistently underscores on automated assessment. He folded the report, put it on the desk. The notation recommends that future human applicants with sustained training hours be assessed through direct evaluation rather than algorithm, he said. An instructor-conducted evaluation. The board has requested that I draft the evaluation criteria. I waited. I am going to need your input, he said. You are the only Track 4 incumbent who can tell me what to look for. I thought about 3,000 hours. I thought about what they had built, and what they'd built in exchange for, and what they looked like from the outside versus the inside, and how you could test for the specific kind of pattern recognition that only comes from that many hours of live resistance, and how you wrote that into a rubric that a Valdris instructor could use on a human they'd never met. That's going to take a while, I said. The review board has given me 2 months, he said. You complete your cycle in 3 weeks. I would like you to spend the intervening 5 weeks on the evaluation framework. I'm not an instructor. No, he looked at me. You are the subject matter. I thought about my father's gym. The mats, the smell of the floor, the sound of live rolling, the specific way the younger kids would sometimes land a technique correctly and look up surprised, not because they'd planned it, but because the hours had deposited it there, and they'd found it by feel. I thought about what you would have to measure to know whether someone had enough of those hours for the deposit to matter. Okay, I said. The 5 weeks of framework work were unlike any other 5 weeks I spent at Valdris. The cycle finished for the rest of the cohort on schedule, final evaluations, classification confirmations, assignment orders. I watched Svek receive a command track placement with the quiet efficiency of someone who had known it was coming since before he arrived. Tesvik received a research track notation that surprised everyone who hadn't been watching him closely, which was most people. He was so obviously built for combat that the analytical preference he'd been developing alongside it had gone unregistered. Even Vren had his second cycle completion confirmation filed without ceremony, and took it in the Vareth way, without expression, without comment, with the slight jaw lowering that said the accounting is complete and correct. I received mine on the same day. Track 4, cycle complete, classification revised to non-standard incumbent. And then I stayed. The framework work happened in a small room adjacent to Orak's office. A working room with a wall display and 2 chairs, and a table that held whatever documentation we were working from. Orak would come in at a set time each morning, already having reviewed the previous day's draft section, and we would work through it in a specific way. He would read a section aloud. I would tell him what was missing or what was wrong. He would ask questions until he understood why it was missing or wrong, and then he would revise. He was very fast at revision. He held the whole thing in his head and could adjust one part without losing the logic of the adjacent parts, which was a skill I hadn't expected, and which I came to think of as the same kind of trained architecture that live rolling builds in the body. A spatial awareness of a complex system developed through long enough exposure to that system under pressure. The hardest section to write was the one dealing with hours. Not the counting. The counting was straightforward, a minimum threshold below which the somatic archive wasn't reliable and above which it was. The hard part was writing it in a way that an evaluator could verify without just taking the applicant's word for it. Training logs can be falsified. Competition records are incomplete. The only reliable test was live evaluation. Put the human in front of a live opponent and watch whether the proprioceptive read was actually there. That means every human applicant with a plausible training history gets a live evaluation, I said one morning, 3 weeks into the framework work. Yes, Orak said. That's a significant resource commitment. Less significant than misclassifying another one. He looked at me. In either direction. In either direction was the phrase that clarified something I hadn't fully thought through. The algorithm's failure wasn't just that it had put me in track 4 when the form said recreational contact sport. It was that the same failure mode could run in reverse. It could filter out a human who had the hours, who had the archive, who belonged in track 4, and send them to a lower track where they'd spend a cycle frustrated and under-challenged and producing below their actual capacity. The form worked against both outcomes. The direct evaluation fixed both. We finished the framework on the last day of the 5th week. ORAC reviewed it one final time, asked 3 questions that required minor adjustments, and then filed it with the review board without further comment. 3 days later, he told me I was assigned to remain at the Institute for an additional orientation period as an evaluation track resource, which meant, in practical terms, that I would be present when the first human applicants came through the new direct evaluation process, available for consultation on what the evaluators were observing and whether their read was correct. It was not an instructor position. It was exactly what ORAC had said in his office. I was the subject matter, and the subject matter needed to be in the room. I stayed for another 2 months. I watched 6 human applicants come through the evaluation. 2 of them had the archive. You could see it immediately in the live evaluation, in the way their body responded to committed attack before the visual signal had completed, in the efficiency with which they found solutions that weren't the ones the evaluator's movement had been designed to produce. Both of them were placed in track 4. The other 4 were placed correctly in lower tracks, assessed accurately, without the algorithmic error that had sent their information through a rubric built for different inputs. The 6 evaluations were the clearest accounting I ever saw of what the hours actually built. Not strength, not speed, not technique in the abstract sense. A specific depth of pattern recognition, operating at the level of the body, that had been deposited there by thousands of repetitions of a problem that couldn't be fully solved by thought, only by accumulated response. ORAC watched all 6 evaluations. He didn't say much during any of them. He filed notes after each one. I didn't read the notes. I didn't need to. He nodded, the secondary jaw, not recalibrating this time, something that looked more like settling, like a weight that had been suspended and had finally found its place on the scale. "One more thing," he said. "Sergeant, the demonstration bout, your answer when I asked if the placement was an error. I said ask me at the end of the cycle. The cycle ends in 3 weeks. I thought about it again. Not just the bout, not just the cycle, the 11 months, the drilling and the translations and the gaps I'd closed and the ones I hadn't. Tesvik's 3-joint leverage and Svek's quiet nod and Vren in the equipment room asking about the entry point like someone who genuinely wanted to know. The morning conditioning route and the specific smell of Valdris Prime at dawn. The way the sparring hall acoustic panels vibrated faintly when the bout inside was serious enough. It wasn't an error, I said. The algorithm made a mistake. The output was right. ORAC looked at me. His face did the thing that I had learned by then to read, the brow ridges settling, the secondary jaw level, the posture at a specific angle. It was the expression he used when an assessment had been completed, and the conclusion was filed. "Dismissed," he said. I walked out. In the corridor outside his office, the light was the same flat institutional gray it always was, and the distant rhythm of the sparring halls was the same, and nobody was looking at me. Just a cadet in gray-black kit walking back to the cohort bay. I didn't know it yet, but the evaluation framework ORAC and I wrote over those 5 weeks would still be in use at Valdris Combat Institute 6 years later. It's the reason there are 14 human cadets in Track 4 right now, assessed through direct evaluation rather than algorithm, placed correctly because someone finally built the rubric for it. The form that started it all, the clerical misfiling, the drop-down that didn't have the right box, the algorithm that approximated jiu-jitsu as an intermediate Valdris combat certificate, is framed on the wall outside the Institute's main intake office. Orek had it mounted there after the classification review was finalized. He never explained why. He didn't need to. Anyone walking past it and reading the original classification notes, and then the review board's notation, can follow the argument. You can see exactly where the algorithm failed, and exactly what it missed, and exactly what that failure produced when it put the wrong cadet in the right room. The secondary jaw thing, I eventually understood, was not recalibration in the computer sense. It was what Valdris-born faces do when they're looking at something new and choosing to take it seriously, not filing it away, not dismissing it, holding it up and looking at it carefully, the way you look at something that doesn't fit any existing category and that you suspect is going to require you to build a new one. It was the right response. It was the right room.